Hi guys, this is Conscious Conversation, episode 20. You're here with me, Craig Seaton.
And Chet Carson. How are you doing, Craig?
I'm very well, mate. How are you doing?
Good, yeah. This is a back-to-back podcast. This one will come out on next Thursday, so for most people it'll just be a normal thing. But for us, we've literally just done the previous one, which was on Tuesday, and then this one's on today on Thursday. And yeah, how do you think the last one went in terms of the conversation?
Interesting. I like it. I think that the topic of death is something that I am very interested in. And it's a topic that isn't spoken about as much as something that's common and going to happen to all of us should be spoken about at all. In fact, it's avoided, and we went through all that in the last session. But I think death needs to be spoken about more, and death in different senses, physical, egoic, and the letting go of things that we struggle to let go of. That's practice for death right there, isn't it? And yeah, small ways to allow ourselves to be able to let go. I think non-attachment comes with the understanding of death, and any practices that you work with towards death. It's what else can you do but let go or understand why that mechanism of life is there. What does it teach us? What does it do for us? Rather than it just being feared and that's it, and it's a block of fear, so don't go near it, when there's so much benefit, so much reward by going into it. So I really enjoyed the topic, man. Thank you for your knowledge and sharing on it. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is I felt like there's a couple of things I wanted to mention last time, but I think the podcast went into a direction that obviously naturally it was going to go into that direction, but we were talking mainly about the philosophy of death in terms of the Eastern approach, as opposed to the practicality of it in how we should approach death in today's society. And I want to start off by saying that it's definitely one of those things, and again, it's looking at animals and then comparing how they treat death compared to us. So one thing you will notice if you go into the forest, or if you spend a large portion of the time around animals, wild animals mainly, is that you will never find a dead carcass or a cadaver in the forest, like unless it's been attacked by a predator and there's like a flesh wound or something and it's rotting basically. That's the only time you'll find a dead animal. Normally speaking, you won't tend to find a dead elephant that's died of natural causes on the side somewhere or whatever. And the reason why that happens is because animals know in advance that they're going to die, so they tend to die with dignity and a bit more pride. So what they'll do, and I think we mentioned cobras and snakes in the last one, where cobras will end up coiling around a branch or something and up high in a tree and die there. Other animals have different ways of doing it. Common animals that we know of, birds mainly, pigeons. Again, you will not find a pigeon that's just died of natural causes at the side of the street. It will go somewhere and they'll die peacefully. And I think they tend to die in nests and wherever they've created their own habitats. But I found that really fascinating, how human beings just don't have that grace or that elegance towards death. And it's a lack of understanding of what the process of death is. And I think it's something that, do you know how we aspire when we're young to create this life, and we have all these aspirations of where we want to go in life and what we want to do. I think we should have that same sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like intensity and passion towards the way we're going to die. And again, this probably sounds insane. Like why would you want to do that when death is supposed to be the passing of one soul from the next, from this lifetime to the next lifetime? But I feel as though there has to be some sort of grace towards that. And if we don't have that, then generally speaking, the process of death becomes more of an insecurity on humanity in itself. Whereas if we approach it in the way maybe the Native Americans did, if you watched Avatar, the movie that came out in 2009, a lot of their culture from the Na'vi was based on Native American cultures and other tribal cultures. And you saw the way they would treat death. It was this massive ceremony, they'll sing, and then this one person that's dying, the entity passes on, and they have this mourning phase and period, and then they move on. And I think we need something like that grounds us in today's reality, but we don't have that because religions all have their own ways of doing it, and even then there's a process of insecurity that comes along with death that's never been addressed. So maybe we could go into how you would approach death, first of all, and I think you briefly mentioned it in the last one, which obviously will probably sound insane, where you said you're looking forward to death, and it's something that we should be openly admitting to, but we can't, because when you say that, it's like, are you suicidal, or is your life not that great that you're willing to die? And the second thing I want to go into, just before I forget, later on down the line if I don't mention it, is that we're living our lifestyle like we're immortal. That's what the problem is with today's society. We're living like we're going to live forever. The accumulation of wealth, the amount of money that people are greedy about, just holding on to things. We're living like we're going to be immortal. And I think Sadhguru mentioned in the book, and it's actually a Sanskrit quote, and I don't know which scripture it's come from, but it might have come from the Vedas. It says that life is joy, but death is compassion. And if you wrap your mind around what that means, life is joy, yeah, you can kind of understand that. It's great when things are going great, but death is compassion. It means that when the time is right, the best thing you can ask for is death. When you're living a life with misery and pain, and let's say you've come down with pathological illness, a terminal illness, and the last couple of months leading to your death, and it's going to be your inevitable death. You're just delaying it depending on the protocols you're taking. So technology and interferences by the medical field will allow you to extend that. But at the end of the day, you're going to die, and the process of getting to that death for some people is excruciating. It's more painful than just letting the person go. So if you look at people that are on the life machines and stuff, that process is painful, and you can see it in the person. The energy is literally being taken away from their face and the rest of their body, but you're keeping them alive on these machines. So the quote, life is joy, but death is compassion. People want to strive for immortality, but it's actually not immortality that you're looking for. It's choosing your own death. So we can go back to references from the past. So there's a character in the Mahabharata, and then he was referred to in the Bhagavad Gita. Briefly, it was talked about. Bhishma. He had the boon that he could die. He could choose when he wanted to die and how he wanted to die. And that in itself is probably a better sort of situation to be in than someone who's immortal, because you can't. You literally, you see people that you love dying around you, and you go through life's pain and you literally can't plug out. So having the option of choosing your own death is more beneficial than immortality itself. But yeah, so there's two different things we want to go into. So which one do you want to start off with?
Well, let's just go with what you were saying there. So you need to run from that thread. Yeah. And the idea of immortality and how technology or science fiction is trying to show that there's a way for that, and a potential truth in how that's going to come about. I watched Altered Carbon. I don't know if you saw it on Netflix.
Yeah, the series.
Yeah, and it's from a book, and how they showed it that you can take consciousness and it's uploaded somewhere, and then that information can be put in another body, and you can have loads of clones, or very higher and lower class society, and how people are affected by this technology and how life is lived through it. And it's interesting, isn't it, that we want to live forever. And I think that's an obvious conclusion to jump to if you haven't sat down and really think, do I want to live forever? Like, what comes with living forever? All the information you want, all the knowledge that you want, but too much of anything, and too much of different experiences, and you might not know who you are, or you might find a deeper sense of what you are in life. It'll be fascinating, I think, but I wouldn't say, if you had the choice, yes or no, I'd probably say no, because there's going to be a time when you go, okay, I've seen enough. Or, even if you understand the cycles of things like the wars and the pains and the grievances, and you're actually fully okay with that, and it doesn't mean you'll ever stop being sad, but there can be that point where you go, that's just how life is, and you can continue to explore life in so many different ways, and life's always going to evolve, isn't it? It's always going to continue. But for that reason is also why I don't see that I would choose to be here forever, because life uses its means to get to the next point. I see it as, wherever we are in civilization and society. I was watching something, and it was saying that from cave drawings, it was like, I want to say it was 5,000 years, maybe more, where they went from cave drawings to nothing else. Nothing else came for so many thousands of years, and then technology does what it does, and it's just going faster and faster. And whether it's natural or technological, life will use what it uses. And I'm here, and I'm here now, and I have my lifespan, which has always been increasing as well, hasn't it? From when it used to be like 25, 30 years to 40, 50, 60. Now we think, what's the average, like 70, 80? Yeah. People live to 100. maybe this is going to continue as well as life around us gets easier to take care of, hospitals, cleaner, etc. But to know when to die, like when it's time to go. You were saying about the animals, they go home, and dogs do it, don't they? Dogs will go behind a tree or under the porch, wherever it is that their zone is, to die. And knowing that it's your time and you're ready for it, rather than fighting and running, even if you're getting older and you're not confronting it, that must make it so much harder and so much, I want to live forever, I want to keep going, because there's no peace with the other end. It's like an argument. If you cannot see the person who you're arguing with's side and their point of view, you want to be right with everything, and you'll be blind to their side. You'll just be completely ignorant of it because you don't want it and it's not what you've experienced, so this is how it's going to be. And that experience of not dying, which we haven't ever truly had. After we've had experiences, we go to sleep unconscious, we wake up conscious again. Where have you been? Where have you gone? Obviously dreaming, if you don't remember your dreams, where were you in that unconscious period? Is that what people are fearing when death comes around? I'm very, very open to exploring it. I'm very happy to look at when death arises. But as you were saying in the last session before this, I'm in no rush. Life is so great. There's so much to explore with life. But I would like to welcome death with a very open mind and accepting of the time that it comes about. I have no intention to live forever. Reincarnation, again, is just a theory and a philosophy from personal experience. I do believe in it. People who've got great awareness, way greater awareness and skills than I ever have, they've said this, and I believe that kind of stuff in the teachings through Buddhism and whatnot. Whether you access the memories or not, which is something we tapped into last time, again, right now I don't need to know, it's just I'm here with this life, I'll give it everything I can, and I'm ready to die at the end of it. Yeah, that's how I see it.
So there's 2 points I want to go into. So the first one, the fact that domestic animals can also see death as well. So let's put that to one side. The second point was, God, I forgot it already. What was it? Let me just think. The second point was, so we had the domestic animals. And then what else did you say about the process of death?
It was living forever, when it's time to let go, welcoming it.
I've completely forgot it, but let's go back into the animal one and then we'll bring it back whenever I remember. So it's interesting that even domesticated animals are aware of their own death. Oh, that was it. So tying that in with the fact that we've created this fairy tale life. As soon as life is, when it's created and the baby comes out, we've taught that young child as it's grown up that life is everything, and we've always taken away the darker side or the other side of life, which is death. So if you look at the old movies, the kids' movies that you watch, they show life in its fullest, and especially these days, it's even worse than it used to be in our days. At least in our days, they would go into situations. So, for example, if you remember Lion King, when Mufasa dies, themes like that are entwined in the actual story and that's why those stories are almost archetypal, because it gives you both aspects of life, which is what we can resonate with. Whereas if you have stories, and I've never watched it, but I think Jordan Peterson was mentioning it, that he didn't really like Frozen because of the narrative that it was pushing, the political narrative that was entwined in the actual story. When it pushes things that are, almost artificial or superficial or created by human thought, and it goes against what nature is saying, that's when we tend to have problems. So when we isolate death and put it to one side and say, don't worry about that, let's focus on life, then you take away from the meaning of death. And when death does happen, and death will happen like we mentioned in the previous podcast, it's the one thing that's guaranteed. You're born, which means you're going to die. Everything else is an if or a but. So, whether you become successful or not is an if or a but. Whether you end up being homeless is if or a but death is guaranteed. And when you take away, because we know that birth is guaranteed, it's happened to us, so birth is guaranteed. When you take away the other side of the coin, so you've got the heads but you haven't kept the tails, then you put yourself in a situation where you're now having to sugarcoat everything and gloss it over and say, oh, don't worry, this is what death is, and then you never fully give the explanation to a child. Because when I was young, the first two things I wanted to know, number one, where did babies come from? And that was, it had its own narrative and its own story. And number two, what happens when we die, and what is death itself. And you'll see that young children, when they lose their parents, so kids that are between the ages of newborns, obviously they don't have a memory at all of their parents once the parents passed on, but in terms of early adolescence, so say between the ages of 7 to 12, kids that have experienced death in that time frame or that age will generally swing one way or the other way. They generally tend to forget what their parents were like, or the parent that passed away, or the relative that passed away, or they will have some sort of traumatic experience from that, which will later on manifest itself into something. And I've noticed this in people as well, that people that have lost their parents young, it's created a psychological hole because you haven't addressed that process of death in itself. And again, it's a societal problem. Religions have always shied away from it as well in the past. And also in today, you would think that science, with all the technological breakthroughs that are happening, you would think that we would finally be able to address, or maybe even go into 5% of the experience of what death is going to be like. And we can't do it because we're not willing to address it. And I think that is where it has to start from. You have to address it for what it is and then start peeling the layers off to explain what's happening. So going back to the domesticated animals, even creatures that we've made almost live human lives with us. You know, they sleep with us, they eat with us, they shit with us. Those animals still know that when it comes to death, this is the right way to go. So there has to be something that's missing from human lives that we're not really looking at, or we're not putting a magnifying glass over. So, yeah.
Yeah, that aspect of domestic dogs still doing it. How long will they continue to do that for? I wonder. You mentioned that they're doing that. So yeah, that's a good point. But will they phase out of that? Or are they so instinctual as animals are, it'll always be a part of what they do?
Yeah.
You know, you think of how dogs used to be, and wolves before they were domesticated, and you know, behaviour patterns change so much. It's very similar to what's happened to humans. We've created a very accessible and easy world, and not the most intelligent way, but a way that made sense at the time, but has outtuned us from certain elements of nature and what we learn from that. And to use our thought, which has been discouraged along the way, or it's gone along other paths away from how nature would present things. I mean, you wonder how much speculation has then come out of what we were thinking, and then we're lost in thoughts, and then we're thinking on, while nature was always showing us how it is and the process of things. And in our fear or ambition to try and change nature's natural rhythms, it's really interesting, actually, I think, to see that that's what we've been doing in a way, because we don't want to give in to whatever can't be resisted. You know, it's like death can't be resisted, or you've got to do certain things, or you have to grow, or you let go of relationships, or all these things that are occurring whether you want them to or not, that are going to happen. And that is the root of our unhappiness or resistance to life. It's because we don't accept it. When I say accept it, I don't think it's like, no, I'm not having that, I'm going to make sure this outcome happens. It's like, I've always found a better method to be, I accept what's happening there, whether I don't like it or despise it or absolutely love it. I accept it's happening. What am I going to do based on that? What will I do around that? Can I inject compassion into whatever's occurring by accepting it, but still have the want to change things if that want seems right? But with death, we're not going to do that. Technology, maybe something will happen along those lines. Maybe we'll get something like consciousness transference. Who knows? I would never eliminate any scientific possibility. You see how it's always moved on, and through movies and whatnot, was always sort of given the narrative where technology will go. But as regards to how I like to see life in the most natural means, the most organic means possible, is to die, is to accept death, is to go with death and not resist that part. Just as much as you can't resist your body growing, right? You know, you're a kid and you got growing pains and the body's stretching and aching and painy. What can you do? You just got to get on with it. You could resist it, go, oh, I hate this part, I hate this. Every single day, focus on it, think, oh, it's here again, don't want it, spend years doing that. Then when it goes away, you might spend a few weeks or months or years hating that it's going to come back. And we see just how we chuck suffering upon ourselves. It might be unpleasant, might not like it, but learn to accept it and learn what decisions we want to base on top of it to make it more hospitable to our lives. But yeah, embracing death and welcoming it and seeing how we can work in line with nature, always coming back to nature, it knows.
Yeah, I think that comes from an insecurity of not realizing what we are and who we are. Because our understanding, the general consensus is, I look at you and you are this body and this flesh, and that's the only way you identify yourself as. And I feel like most of the insecurities that we have in the West today is based on a very limited understanding of who you really are. And it's through experience and exposure that you really start to transcend that reality of who you really are. And it's like what you do with your REM sleep. That's a really good way, because in a form, sleep is a small part of what death may feel like, because you're transitioning from being awake to sleep, and there's not many people that can be present or be conscious when that transition is happening between being awake and being asleep. So I think once you learn what the distinction is and what that transition feels like, and there are many ways of doing it. So one way is how you've been doing it for many years, which is going into the process of understanding REM sleep and experiencing REM sleep and catching yourself out and realizing, actually, I'm asleep. It's being conscious in that environment. And the other way, the easier way, I think, is, I would say, not the easy way, but the foundation or the precursor is, like what we mentioned previously, is go out there in the wild and experience what life is like in the wild. And this is one of the reasons why, going back to our second podcast, our first podcast, when we talked about the ashrams. So we have the brahmacharya ashram, we have the grahast ashram, which is the householder. So the brahmacharya ashram is the student, the grahast ashram, which is the householder, so the person that's married. Then we have the sannyasa ashram, where this is the one where you're supposed to let go of your belongings and metaphorically, you're supposed to go into the wild and live as a person that doesn't identify themselves as the person they were previously in society. And by doing that and actually going into nature, which is what the old people used to do in India, when they used to live in nature in smaller ashrams or in nature with the surroundings, it's a completely different experience, because you know straight away when you're sleeping outside that, depending on the area you're living in, so if you're living in a place where there's poisonous animals, or if there's bears and tigers and lions and even elephants out there, there's a good chance that you might get trampled, or you might get killed, or you might come into contact with one of these creatures. So you're living in that full organic understanding that, each day might be your last and you don't know how you're going to go. So by experiencing that, and it's something what I've read that war veterans and people that have been in war experience as well, knowing that every day you might, or people that are actually refugees in a war environment, knowing that tomorrow might be your last day, or something might happen and the people around you might disappear, you really start to appreciate who you really are in context to all those people, plus in the context of the surroundings. So if you start to appreciate the tiny little things, so when you're having a laugh and a joke, it becomes something more meaningful, because you know that this might be your last opportunity to have that. So life becomes way more grounded, and you almost come back into reality in terms of what nature was supposed to be like. And I'm not trying to say that war zones are natural, but the fact that you're living a life knowing that maybe tomorrow you might not live, or the person around you that you love might not be there tomorrow as well, is you really tend to appreciate yourself in that environment. So going back into the wild, living in that environment is the most organic way of understanding who you are in correlation to the surroundings and where you've come from. So, and I think the analogy that we used last time was just looking up at the stars and understanding how small you are in comparison to the rest of the universe, or a fraction of the universe that you can experience through the sense of sight. So to come to terms with that, and then to go into processes of meditation or the REM sleep aspect, and to understand that there's this other part of us that exists, to touch that part or to kind of dip your toes in that part will give you a sense of what the process may be like when you come to death, or when death is calling. So I think it's really important for us to really have these experiences and do the breath work and meditation, and surrounding ourselves with people that have experienced that side or have become masters of that side, to get some sort of understanding, or to get some sort of glimpse of what that side of life is. And going back to what you said about the consciousness and how technology wants to isolate it and then maybe transfer it into something else, in my personal opinion, I don't think it will be fully possible until we start to understand what consciousness is and where it's stored. For the moment, we think that intellect and the way we're thinking and the brain is the consciousness, and it's the storage component of the consciousness. But going into Eastern philosophy and going to what you've experienced yourself as well, you don't experience sensations in your brain, you experience the sensations in your body. So if you touch something, you experience it at the tip of your fingers, not in the brain. Yes, it's registered in the brain, which acts as the CPU, but the experience is happening in the object that you are doing it with. So if you go back into the analogy of the PC parts, the graphics card is where the graphics is being generated, and you're seeing it on the screen once it's been processed through the CPU and then visualized to the screen. but it's not happening at the CPU level. It's happening still in the graphics card, and it's happening in the screen. So we need to understand it in that aspect where life is happening and it's being processed in the brain, but it's happening through our body. So until we figure out what consciousness is and where it is, I don't think we'll fully be able to transmigrate the consciousness from one entity to another entity. And especially if it's going into a artificial entity or a cyborg, I don't think it will be possible in that way until we fully understand it. And I think the Chinese say, we believe in just one brain, but they believe in the three dantians, which is the three brains. So we have that gut feeling that we have, and we don't know where it comes from. And the Chinese believe that is one of your dantians. It's actually your strongest dantian. That's where you want to store most of your energy, not up here. And this is why mental health is another issue in today's society, is because we're storing everything here as opposed to storing in the other storage components that we have. So we're overloading our hard drive, the main hard drive, instead of separating it into other smaller hard drives across the body. So
it's an interesting point. If we were to use the Eastern chart, I suppose, a little bit more in the Western mind, in the Western lifestyle, to see the three dantians or the three different storage areas, and like whether it's head, heart and gut, just something to work with a little bit more than overloading this. So when we are just using the mind so much, let's take this subject of talking about death. The experiences that we would have encountered will either be loss or fear based around death. Do we explore any further with the heart there, or with feeling, or do we go, right, that's it, I'll let my head figure it out, or there's no way to know, or there's just nothing implored other than the basics of what we've accepted, like you said when you questioned as a child. Are we satisfied with what we learned then, or do we just leave it be, or do we search for more answers? And if we were to search, not just using that one faculty of the mind, we brought it into your heart, how do you feel about it, the gut, what does the gut tell you about it, and not just the initial reactions, because we've conditioned ourselves so long to just respond to it a certain way or anything. Giving it that time to sit, which is the meditation, and just being with it and using the other areas. It's still quite a foreign thing, I think, for Western people to understand that we can live through the heart and through feeling. Masculine and feminine, you've got your obvious differences of guys being more heady, stuck, logical, analytical, and women being more, or feminine energy being more expressive and emotional. And it's trying to balance them both in the middle and get them to see the other sides. And it's the greatness of the duality of the world once again, and we can figure it out. But to use those other centers, use your heart to feel things through. How do you feel about death? How does it, you feel that this is what happens to everybody? Do you still want to resist that and still want to be mad and angry with it or afraid of it? Not that there's anything wrong with being afraid of it, but we have to expose ourselves to it and go into it and learn about it and start to accept that we can drop the walls, and it doesn't have to be a scary, terrifying monster that's coming for us. We can just completely change the narrative and see it as a very graceful element of life, like it's the end of this part. But when you hold on to so much, no, I am here, this is me, this is my body, this is how life is, and once I'm gone, I'm gone. Could be true, I don't believe it is. I've had experiences and my belief systems tell me something else is true. If that's the belief system you want to go with, and that, then fine. But as with anything massive, let's look at everything we can about it and not just go with the conditioning, especially when the world is conditioned in such a strong way. The Western mindset is so against anything other than traditionally, religiously, heaven and hell after death. We need to relook at everything, even the beliefs that we're against. Like maybe religion, people might be against that now. Let's look at why that is. Let go, format your new beliefs and your new experiences based off what's been said and gone, and that we don't have to use as framework anymore. Or if it works for you, go with it. Just always be open and feel things out, not just logically in the mind. Easier said than done, I think. Yeah.
So let's talk about that then. So how do you approach death in today's society? How do you teach someone to approach death? And let's say if you had a kid, how would you teach a child about death, and how would you expose them to death to get that understanding of what it is?
I wonder what kind of age it is where there's a safety mechanism to go into and explain it. Okay, this is when death is, because like with anything, there's innocence of children doesn't need to be lost until it becomes a weight. Like people talk about Father Christmas, Santa Claus is real, and somebody might still believe in that at 16, 17 if the conditioning was always cemented in there, while other kids figure it out earlier, or
So what about adults in general then?
Adults for
the topic of death and how to.
Well, I even think with kids there'll be that certain point where you go, right, if you talk to that person wisely and enough self-exploration has happened in you in your life to be able to pass it out and let that person know these are the limits of where the conversation or the dimension goes, and you play in between them to figure things out. Here's life, here's death. What's going on within that space? What are those entities about? And if you can condition a child to have that level of acceptance from an early age, like, wow, how incredible. Sadhguru, he told his daughter didn't let her be taught language or to read from a book, I believe he said once. And just to free your mind from any of those constraints and the limits that comes with language or other people's experience or memories. We need all that stuff to get by. But if the opportunity is there to not go that way, what will that bring? So if you can talk to a child about death or things that are going on in the world from a young age, to probably completely free them out from a load of fear about, right, Granny's dead. What happens to her? Nobody knows. She's gone to sleep. She's in that box. Not for me, that. I don't want that. And it's the resistance and the fear we have to talking about it because we've not looked at it ourselves. So to understand, using what we explained earlier, the cycles of life, that day and night, sleep and awake, seasons, darker, lighter, like it's all there, it's all always there, it's nothing to fear, it's to be part of it, be part of life, which means being part of death. Life doesn't cut death out. I don't think it's a complete opposite. When we talk about life and living, it's an act, it's always happening, even when you're asleep. Are you dead? You're not alive at that point, you're still a part of life. And bringing that part of death into it. We can't see over the barrier, but don't let it stop anything. Don't let that not being able to see or going into the unknown, essentially, or taking the leap or trying something out your comfort zone, which is what we're doing with death. Don't let it isolate us and fear us. And an open dialogue, an open topic, and getting people to understand, maybe looking at the Eastern traditions first, because they seem to have a better grasp of that ease than we do. That will tell us that we can talk about this now and we can go into it and we don't have to fear. It's maybe people who are worried or concerned are those who will start to look at it or they're interested in it like we are. Yeah. The average person maybe not so much. That's why it can be a difficult conversation. But even if schools brought it into not RE but whatever the equivalent of religious education is nowadays, if there's a topic about just general life awareness, it would radicalize people's minds in the sense that it would radically change them. You would just think so different if that structure is presented to you. Yeah. Something as major as life and death, it's a part of life, but here's why we don't need to fear it. I wonder what it would do to society if people thought differently.
Yeah. So going into what you just said about the whole the child experience thing and experiencing Granny's dead, so interesting. So I want to tie into what we said before about kids. I've just thought about it now, and I look at the reactions of kids and the kids that have experienced that. It's conditioned. It's 100% conditioning. Where if you go to a funeral, I've been to many funerals where kids have been around, especially when they're young kids and they're not teenagers yet, so they're pre-adolescents. You look at their reaction, and I've always found it fascinating to look at their reaction. They almost look around and see what other people's reactions are to make a sort of a conclusion of how they should react in that situation. And kids sometimes are more confused when someone's moved on or passed on than they are grieving or scared, or maybe that's their grieving process, but they don't have an idea of what's really happened. So the way, and maybe this is where the trauma that we talked about previously, the issues that you have later on in life stem from, is the fact that you didn't know how to deal with that situation. You've been told that you should deal with it in this way, that grieving, you see your father crying because your mother's passed away, or you see your parents crying because your siblings passed away, and from that you start to get this fear already instilled in your brain, in your cognitive process, and then you start to realize that this is how the reaction of death is supposed to be like. So you and I, are people that have grown up, haven't fully understood what death was meant to be in a subjective way, what it's supposed to feel for you, because you've been told this is how you're supposed to react, or you've been told unconsciously because you've seen the reactions of other people that this is how it's supposed to feel like. So the actual process, and you can see it, like I said, in a child's face when they first go to their first funeral or they go through their first passing, they don't know how to react in that situation. You don't see tears coming out of their eyes because they don't know how to deal with that situation. Unless they've experienced that through maybe a friend telling them, look, this is how what happened when my mum died, and then they've seen that, their reaction from someone they care about, that's when it's almost, they've taken that reaction into themselves and they've adopted that. So I feel as though it's a conditioning process. It's something that you've been taught. Whereas if, like you said about Sadhguru's kid, if you get taught from a young age that this is how it's going to be and this is how you're going to learn, I want you to think for yourself as opposed to being taught what is the right way or other people's perspectives and how you should be reacting based on that. I think there'll be more of an organic way of dealing with death. And I think I'd come to that realization from, so my sort of approach to death has never been 100% concrete, and I didn't know how I was going to deal with it because I've never really had to deal with like a massive death in my life at the moment. Well, there's been people that I've cared about that have passed away, but they haven't been massively attached to my life in this moment in time. Yeah, maybe one time in the past before, but right now it hasn't been the case. So maybe this is one of the reasons why I haven't had that trauma already set in place for me. But the way I look at it is, especially now that I've read this, I'm reading Sadhguru's book, is exactly the way I felt back then, which is there shouldn't really be a fear of this death because it's going to happen. You know, why should you fear something that's inevitable? You know, if I was to tell you that tomorrow, Craig, there's a tsunami that's going to hit this place and we're just going to end up dying, you know, there's two ways you can go about it. You can start running around panicking and trying to, make the most of the situation and abuse the situation and do whatever you want, or you can actually just sit there quietly and just kind of accept what's going to happen and just try and make the most of that moment. And I think that's how animals do it. When they know something's going to happen, yes, the first instinct is to try and get to high ground, but once they realize that actually there's nothing I can do in this situation, they go with complete sort of dignity. And it's something that prominent figures in the past used to do. So the kings in India used to do the same thing. When you know death is coming, you give up all your belongings, you give that to your kids in the kingdom, and then you move to the forest and you live your life out in the forest. And one thing I'd also want to point out to you is, and I think I read it in the book that I was reading, Sadhguru's death book, that you should, and this is going to go against everything what people do today, but and again you have to take this with a pinch of salt. He says that you shouldn't die around people you care about. The problem is when you die around the people you care about, the attachment that you have towards these people, it makes the process harder. So imagine that you're dying on a bed and you've got your loved ones around you, that's going to make it 10 times harder. Just put yourself in that situation. That's going to be a lot harder than it is if you decide that I'm going to just stay away from you guys and I'm going to die on my own. And I'm going to go through this process on my own. And that's how it should be. It should be a very individual journey. Because that's what it is. When you die, you're not taking anyone else with you. You're dying alone. So why shouldn't the last few moments of your life be alone as well? But then people say, well, I want to be with you till the moment that you die. And I kind of understand where that's coming from. But at the same time, I look at it and I think, I would rather die alone. Why would I want people around me to see me die? Yes, once I'm dead and I've taken care of myself, then you can get rid of the body and you can do whatever you want with the body. But in that process of death, why would I want to expose this sort of journey with someone else? I don't want to share with anyone else. It's just me and this journey and alone. So, and it's the same as when you came into this world. You came into this world alone. You just don't remember what the process was like because you didn't have the sort of the physiological development in the brain, and the brain wasn't fully developed for you to remember that experience. So you went through that process alone and you came into this world, so you're going to do the same thing when you die, so why don't you do it alone? So I think that is something that we need to really think about, and the only way you're going to address that is if you think about it maybe 5 minutes a day, 2 minutes a day, maybe even a tiny glimpse of just thinking about what's the process going to be like and how you want the process to be. And I think by doing it on a repetitive basis, eventually you will come to terms with it, because you don't know how you're going to die. So tomorrow you might get run over by a car. For me, I might fall off a cliff when I'm climbing and stuff. So I don't know how I'm going to die. So why try and delay the inevitable when the inevitable might be tomorrow or might be in 2 seconds from now? So come to terms with that and then decide how you want to address that process. And then that way, I think that makes the grieving process, when you go into situations where people around you are dying, it makes the grieving process that much more, I would say, easier, if you want to call it easier, or less hurtful or less or agonizing for us. So I don't know how you would deem that in that process.
I think that learning to accept death on all sides and to do it on your own, I think people would struggle generally on their own, to learn about death from the side of experientially. Are you experiencing it within people close to you or through reading and studying? There are definitely two very different elements. I myself haven't experienced any massive trauma of death in my life. My granddad, my grandma's, everybody generally about this age. The earliest death was me when I was 16. But I remember being at the funeral or being told it, and I was like, all right, like I wasn't phased, and I don't want to sound disrespectful. God, no, I'm not being disrespectful because I didn't feel anything like that. It was just I wasn't phased. And when my granddad passed away, I loved him. I suppose how your relationship is with these people as well is an effect. We had a fine relationship. It wasn't super close. But my other people, my family, my older brother, my cousins, they were all crying and really upset. And I was like, why do I not feel like this? This is strange that I don't feel that upset. And every time I've ever thought about it, all I've ever come to the understanding of it is, it's just life. Like it's a part of it. There's obviously being cold and not interested in being there for somebody when they've going through a death or somebody turning away from their feelings to get over a certain event. And it wasn't anything like that for me. It was like, okay, yeah, he was old and he was unwell. That's what happens. Again, there's still the grieving process of crying and feeling it through, which is a part of it for everybody, really. Unless you've already accepted it on so many different levels, which is really, really interesting. Is like that working with grief or upset or accepting of death is way wiser to do before it's occurred. As you said, maybe it'll happen tomorrow, maybe later today. And if you're in that situation or you're trapped or there's something going on and you're not prepared for death, it will just put the body and the brain into panic mode, won't it? Just kicking and screaming for its life. Like we know what happens when we go into fight or flight and we react because there's been no cognition or there's been damaging experiences which has put your automatic mode into that. While when we can do that with more and more events that seemingly are fearful, the less of that reaction it will occur because we've changed the wiring within ourselves. So to practice for death on the side of our friends and our families is completely advisable if you understand it on those levels and doing the practices that we were talking about to allow yourself to move towards death.
Yeah.
Which is probably very scary, thinking about saying should people die alone, I would choose to do that as well. If I had a partner or a family around me at the time, I'll see them for a little bit and be like, right, it's time for me to go. And by that time, people know who you are and you know your reasons why, so they'll be like, right, okay, it wouldn't have to be discussed at a last minute kind of thing with a death. For average people may feel afraid of that experience if there's no exposure at all towards it. So they might be terrified to die alone. And with the attachment to clinging onto the body and the energy around, it makes it a lot harder too, doesn't it? And there was Aldous Huxley. He was injected with LSD when he died. I can't remember how much the milligrams was. I think it's quite a strong dosage. Under supervision of his wife and his own personal doctor. And when he died, he chose to be injected with acid. Like, wow, what a strange experience that must be. You're already going through something so far out, and then you do something by loading a psychedelic on top. I mean, I wonder what the hell happened, like where he was with that experience. It's something I'd very much like to go in raw and meditative and calm and, okay, I'm ready to see this. You've put your affairs in line and you're accepting the death. You're accepting it. One of the issues that we have with ourselves, or the denial of what we don't want to occur, is we will just ignore it. We won't put ourselves in any exposure into it to allow ourselves to go through it. It's like, no, it's not real. It's not real. When things are done last minute, or we put them off because we just don't want to look at it.
Yeah.
And when that occurs with midlife crisis, people, they hate their job, they're stressed all the time, they've got busy family lives, they don't have any time for themselves, they load the body up with unhealthful foods and drinks, and then eventually it hits them because it's like, oh shit, I'm having a midlife crisis and a breakdown, I don't know who I am or what I want. It's because we've not thought about it or give it the space and time along the way to that point. The signs are always present. And the same with death. Let's expose ourselves to it much earlier and not put it off and not try and ignore it until it comes and hits us in the face, and then we're no use to anybody in the situation. think about these things and work towards them as we develop and grow. And a natural inclination to explore spirituality or life, or just life itself, will bring these teachings with it. It's unavoidable. It's unavoidable. So if you're on that path, you'll encounter it. And you'll see, based on your reactions, is it something I'm interested to look into? Or is it, well, not for me, you know?
Yeah.
And why is it not? Why are we choosing to ignore it now? And now, it's the best time to do it, always. Figure out something massive, like life and like what occurs with death. Create yourself some freedom, some peace.
Yeah. So, I just want to point out that when it comes to the process of death, I think you have to train yourself like you would train for anything you do in life, like a skill, like, you know, maybe your exams. When you're studying for your exams, you don't decide that I was going to cram it in last minute, you know, just before I go into the exam. Well, funny enough, if you do that with death, even then you still go away with some sort of understanding of what might happen. Whereas in life, when you do that, chances are you're going to probably come out with a bad grade. But so what we should be doing is every single day, just like anything else you do, your daily sadhans, the things that you do to keep yourself ticking every day, you should be maybe even, like we just said, addressing the process of death and how you would like to go, you know. And like we just said, we'd rather go alone as opposed to being around people. And having that courage, and that's what it is. You really need that courage to address that head on and say, this is how it's going to be. Because when it comes, whether it comes for you or it comes for your loved ones, at least you know you have some sort of understanding of what the process is going to be like. And then you know that how you want to go or how you don't want to go. So if you see the reaction from your loved ones, you know, this is, again, one of the reasons why I don't think you should be around them when they're in those last few hours, because I feel as though wherever their reaction is will instill trauma or fear in you that maybe, you know, I don't want to be in that process. Whereas if you're around someone who's just like, you know, death is coming for me and I'm going to face it head on and I'm just going to go, you know, like a champion, then I think maybe that'd be a completely different. If you had more people that did that, and if we knew that of those people that did that, I think our approach to death would be completely different. And the second thing I wanted to point out was it's very fascinating how. So this is what Sadhguru mentioned in the book, and I was really captivated by this. So he said, you know, and I think it goes back to what the Joker says in The Dark Knight. He says, you know, people show their true color in their last moments, their last few breaths, who they really are. So just tying it into that loosely, Sadhguru says it doesn't matter what kind of person you were in your life, and he's come across these sort of people, thousands of people like this. So you might have been a heinous person, you might have hurt so many people, you might have destroyed so many lives, you might actually kill people as well. But in that period when you know you're going to die, something happens, something just flips, and you become a completely different person. And it doesn't matter how bad you were back then, your approach to life and the person you become is completely different in your last few hours. And it's the same again with animals. In the last few months or maybe the last few weeks of animals, knowing that the animal is going to pass away, their natural instinct suddenly goes out the window. So you look at a tiger, if you go near a tiger that's about to die, and I've had this experience from many years ago with oxen, you know, oxen that were quite violent in nature. So obviously you get the oxen that are used to being around human beings, but then you also get some oxen that are a bit more rebellious and violent in nature, more wild in nature, should I say, instead of rebellious. But wild in nature, when they're about to go, they are completely different. They're tame, they're quiet, they're more sweet than they've ever been in their entire life, and they know straight away that, you know, this is not the violent way or the way of just like, you know, how do we describe it? Like, you know, when you go into the gym and people are looking for that pump, that way of going is not the way to go out. The way to go out is to go out with grace and elegance and just tranquility. And these animals are doing exactly the same thing. So he said people that were prominent figures in the past probably would have done exactly the same thing. So you look at people like Stalin and Hitler, and they probably did the same thing when it came to death, that even though they killed so many people and they lived a life of just misery and pain towards other people, their last few moments were probably just a sort of a form of peace and a way to just say, you know, damn, I've just done all this shit and I'm going to die now, and I just need to make peace with what I've done and just at least live my last few moments as a genuine human being. And it's something you have to confront when you know death is coming for you. And it's something that we've become desensitized to because we don't know when death is coming for us. We've become so out of tune with our bodies, because our bodies will tell us straight away. Our bodies are so good that they'll tell you exactly when it's going to rain as well, when there's rain in the atmosphere. And we know this through farmers that live in India and Africa, that have lived on the farmland for many years. Or you know this from sailors who know straight away when the wind is coming or when a storm is coming. It's through sensitivity of how the body reacts to it. Animals know this, because animals will run to high ground when there's a storm coming. But we've just become so desensitized to it because we're not in touch with our bodies anymore. So when death comes, we get caught off by God, and we're in surprise. And even when death is spontaneous, the death where someone gets run over or something bad happens to them, out of pure accident or out of pure chance, your body knows. Your body has this awareness, couple of hours, maybe a couple of weeks in advance, that it's going to happen, it's going to come for you. And again, is this a metaphysical process, or is it a spiritual process, or is it an actual physiological process that we're not in tune with, like a sixth sense that it's going to happen? So I think that process is very interesting as well. And the more you delve into it, the more you meditate on it. And I've had meditation experiences with you in your class where I felt like I was going to die. And it's funny because you said to me in so many occasions, like when you do your breath work, it's like you're dead. Your body's just literally still as anything. And maybe this is that process of accepting what that phase is into death. So yeah, I just found that really deeply fascinating.
I think going within the natural cycle again of how is death going to be. We look at our natural cycle, right? So you're a fresh little seed when you're born. Shoot out, you do all your growing, you grow around. As you're coming older, you start to slow off a little bit, like natural, what you're saying about the animals. It's just natural to ease off a little bit. So I think with the mind, the experience of life that we're having, the experience itself is conditioning the already conditioned mind. So the age cycle we're in and what we do with that level of energy that we're granted will lead us to next things. It's essentially, if you don't choose to continue learning, or you're interested in what you're interested in, there will still be learning along the way. It's just how aware are we, and that's what observation is, isn't it? It's, I didn't see that before, and I can see it in a new light just because we're watching something. And it's just watch the body, just watch the cycles, and that will tell us where we're at and what sort of demand or what we can get out of ourselves. And then if we go, I want more energy, I'll do some exercise, or I'll eat some food, and whatever. These little factors, it will influence the state of life that we're currently at. And as you get older, you just become a bit more tired, a bit more generally relaxed, though the mind can go very solid, like the grumpy old man syndrome, and lonely and angry and grumpy. Or you can just chill out a little bit more. Like you're going to go generally either of those ways as you're coming towards the end of your life. And with that, maybe the interest and the acceptance of death comes with it as well, because your conversation might start to change, and your interests definitely will change as they have done throughout our lives. But always having our core foundations of the way we do think, or the characteristics that come with the thoughts that we have, behind the thoughts that we have. And to give ourselves the acceptance of following through life. Just follow through life, and it will bring everything to us. The personality, the mind, I want to explore this, I want to know more about that, or I don't want to look at that, whatever, go with them. Use that as a tool to enhance your life. Bottom line, just watch your life from start to finish. And that process will take us on different journeys. And I think whether that interest may be spiritual, maybe physical, maybe, about the physiology, whatever interest we have, characteristics, as long as they're beneficial and helpful in the sense of it's doing good things for us and around us, keep it going. But if you're just watching life, how much we can take from that, and how much more we can accept about the process of it and where it will take us, and where we are on that part of the journey. Just to be in a calm state and have already accepted death, maybe at this age, maybe in 10 years, again, it's very hard, I think, to say, I'm ready for that moment to happen, because when you experience it or talk to people who have experienced it, frightening as hell, absolutely frightening. Which is why those experiences of depth meditation or breath work or retreats or the psychedelics, something that will give us that, this is actually what it's going to be like, as close as I can get you to it, other than actually having to nearly die. How do you think I'm feeling? How was it when you come back? And I know we spoke about it briefly last session, but people who've done psychedelics and they feel like the first 1 or 2 times that, I've done it, I've snapped my mind, I've lost my mind, I don't know where it's going to be. And then generally, if you're healthy, we'll always come back. And if you're doing it in the right settings and you know what you're doing, then the mind will always come back. It always will. But to have had the experience of gone, I became something else. I wasn't me. I wasn't set with my own characteristics. I wasn't with my own personality. I didn't have my usual thoughts. All of that is the identification, is the thing we're afraid of losing in death. It's not, if I have done it this time and my mind's gone, and my partner might be really upset I'm not there for her anymore, or I've got to do this job, or what will other people think, or is this something I do? All these thoughts that come with, away from, trying to subtract from the experience of you're here, you might be in a different mindset, but you're still observing something. So when we take away personality, opinions, relationships that anchor our identification, the things that we own, the things we've achieved, or we want to achieve, all of that is attachment at a form, isn't it? It's like, let go of that and just view life. See what occurs when we just view life. And then you get to use all that stuff on top as enjoyment for life, as doing something meaningful. But having those depth experiences, I think, are very scary. Having done a few, it's something that I wouldn't fear doing it again. There might be the general nervousness, or I'm going to do a deep breathwork session, or DNT, or whatever it is. I'd go into it sort of knowing to expect and trying to let go a little bit further. You relax in a sound bath a little bit more in the meditation or through the breathwork. Yeah. You keep softening, and you feel it, whether the physical body's softening, but the energies inside are like, it's just peaceful. It's quite exciting, but peaceful. And then you'll find if you're drifting off and thinking about something, it's like, no, let that go. Just experience this state of life or death or wherever we're going, without any hooks, without any expectations. I want to see this God. I want this to occur. Am I going to go to that heaven realm? Am I going down to hell? But let it all go, because truly, what do you know of that experience other than what other people have said? And there might be people that you or I choose to follow because we fit in with that belief system. I still don't know if it's true. I just trust the people saying it. And I've had experiences that have led me to think that that's more likely of an option. Then it's just close your eyes and blank. And even if it is close your eyes and blank, you can't experience not experience, as Alan Watts says in a great lecture. So, having experiences that will get closer to death makes you also see what's real and not real about yourself. Yeah. And that's what the psychedelics do. That's what the deep breathwork meditation sessions will do, is, I had fear there, or in a breathwork session, I'm afraid to let go and make a noise. If you're afraid to let go and make a noise, that's a fear that's going to come with you through a death process. Maybe you'll be afraid to make a noise there, and that will hinder the process. Or in such an extreme circumstance, you might not care, might be like, you just completely let go for the first time in death because you can't resist that. Well, not that you can't resist it, is you can't stop it from happening. So we try and allow ourselves in these deathly processes of dropping of personality and ego and attachment to feel it, to be in it through the meditation, through the breath, or through the death, or through the psychedelic. Be with that change. And I hope I can make it clear that point that I'm talking about, that point where this is the change, this is letting go of old. It's so easy to talk about don't be your personality, don't be your egos. It's really hard work because we're doing it every day. We have to catch ourselves time and time again. And that's people who are interested in the work. What about those who aren't? We're so stuck on those levels so much. But when we experience something so powerful, so cathartic, so out of our control, you can let that be your experience and be in that no control and be in, this is it. And within it itself, there's so much energy of your point of awareness.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that you pointed out there. One of the main things that was the theme of that, what you just said there, was the fact that you haven't experienced it. So there are those rare people, and I think I was one of those rare people, but my friend Andy was exactly the same. So we both had this near-death experience with water where we both drowned. And I remember when it happened to me when I was 4 or 5 years old, my first experience of swimming, the initial panic is very brief. It's there. This is how it was for me, and this is how it was for Andy, who's 54 now. So the initial experiencing that process of death was panic, and then immediately there's an experience of just tranquil and peacefulness, because straight away there's nothing you can do in that situation, and it's almost like you said, it's the flight or fight response kicking in, but then it's the opposite of what you think the reaction is going to be, which is more panic and more struggle. it's just immediate giving up immediately. And I think when you go through that process as a person who's experienced that near-death experience or who's got close to it, you have a completely different perspective of life when it comes to the process of death. And the same thing again when you experience that through breathwork or meditation or through psychedelics. When you experience that barrier, and initially there might be a sort of resistance to it, and you might feel as though, no, I don't want to experience that. But when you let go of the resistance, because you know there's nothing you can do in that situation apart from go through that experience, and it's like what you said, it has to be an experience. Because if there is no experience, how can you relate something to being an experience? It has to be an experience. So so when you're going through that window, when you're transitioning from the phase of being what you deem as reality being reality and crossing over to that point where it's going into the realms of sleep or death or deep meditation or whatever you want to call it, it's just the fact that you have to completely come to terms with that situation and say, this is what it is, I'm just going to ride it out. If it is as bad as I think it is, and most times, like 99% of the time, it isn't. It's just all created in your imagination or in your brain. And it's something what Sadhguru mentions in so many of his talks. He says that the greatest issue that we have in today's society is there's two parts of the human faculty that we've lost control of. Number one, we have a vivid sense of memory and a fantastic sense of imagination, and we've allowed those two things to completely take control of us. So in situations where we think that something is bad, again, 9 times out of 10, when you walk away from that situation, you realize actually it wasn't that bad. Is you've created that process in your brain, and again, we let our intelligence or intellect control us and almost become an enemy. So in that process, when we're in those situations where it's almost crossing over and blurring the lines between life and death, is when you truly realize that actually we've allowed those faculties to completely take control of us. So when you let go of those and you accept the situation for what it is when you truly transcend life's, that scenario and whatever the process of transitioning into death is. And the second thing I wanted to point out was it's using that and applying it to different aspects of your life. When you've lost that insecurity of death, it doesn't mean, and it's something that you mentioned, people around you and what people have been conditioned to believe also influence how you're feeling about the situation. So imagine if you decide that actually in this situation I want to die alone and I don't want to be around people. How would your missus feel? How would your parents feel? And almost their insecurity comes upon you and you feel bad about it, so you allow them to come into that vicinity. And then again, it's just a really vicious cycle because they expose themselves to your last few moments of life. And when life is gone, that in itself becomes a traumatic experience. So how do you go about that situation when you're dying or you're in that process of, you know that you're going to die? To push people away also means that you also leave an imprint in them that you push them away. And there isn't a general acceptance in society to push people away when you're dying, It's just not common. It's more the other way around. You want to make people gravitate towards you, so then you spend the last moments with them. So how do we address the situation where society is telling you the opposite?
I think it's very individual, isn't it? Looking at how funerals are or how the end of death. I mean, funerals, man, are so unenjoyable. And I don't mean that, again, about the death of my family, I don't mean disrespectfully. It's like, man, they're so dry and like playing the songs that people play on there. And what feeling do you want? What feeling do you want to create at a funeral? It's up to you, If your family, say you've got a family and your partners and you've got kids or whatever, it's like, right, if I die, do this. And if you're not fussed, well, what would you like to do to your partner? Whatever, what song do you want, man? Depends how we see it. I think what I would personally do is I would scrap the way that they do the funerals here, because I've never been to one and gone, I'm glad I went to that. And I don't, I'm very good at, I suppose, making my own peace with whatever the situation is. With somebody who's died, it's like, I'll do it internally, which the funerals are symbolic. I just think maybe they're so weak in the symbol now and so negative and industrial, they're really like
outdated almost.
Yeah, man. Like if I outdated, that's what they are. They deserve to die.
The irony.
If I had a funeral, it'd be like people come, read some poetry, play a bit of music if you want, like a little show and tell, or literally a celebration of life. There's an element where people want to be sad and they want to feel things through, like that's part of the process as well, and maybe we weave that into it somehow. But if we've had the great opportunity to already make peace with that, or we have a society that intervenes that as, they've died, right, I'm going to miss you, but well done, off you go to the next part, and however we want to take the spin on where we go, maybe more Native American, or maybe Aboriginal, maybe whatever, something where we're joining something bigger, or whatever your view is, make it a celebration rather than something so grim. But again, how much of an upheaval do society need first to that take account? Like if somebody said to me they were doing that for their wedding, or you did, I'd be like, cool, that's mint, yeah, I'll come to that. I say, Chet's died, I'm like, fuck, a funeral, bloody hell, can't go to another one. No, obviously it'll be, maybe it's an interesting point, because if you had a funeral and it was done in a more fun way, like, I'm going to respect this guy, I'm going to show my honour, and how, I'm going to do a little poem, or I'll do something that goes, this is for you, mate, because you had this effect on me in life, so I want to give that feeling back in a way, or to celebrate that you were here. I'm just thinking of this now, and I'm excited for your death. I want to go to your funeral.
You should be.
But it's already like, I'm not saying that's the case for everyone, because how people deal with grief is their own thing, but how much conditioning to deal with grief are we already led into? Are we not willing to allow that to change, because it's always been that way, it's always been that way. As you said about Avatar, it's done, that I see you thing, and she cuts the throat of the animals, and there's a deep respect and a wisdom going, thinking that, can we inject lightheartedness into that, or does it not? Not necessarily for the death, but for the love, the compassion, this was great, this is what we brought to life. I think that's how we'd have to change the structure of it, but as always, well, not as always, because we are very much conditioned like sheep, but it's got to come to ourselves. So if culture would change it, great, people can lead it that way. If you do it individually, it's going to be way more impactful, and if you have that belief and the mentality around it through your life, this is how you'd like to die and why, and you have conversations about it and people see it, it'll be less and less weird when that death occurs. Like weddings, you're not doing a big wedding now, just going off to the woods, the two of us or a few people, and well, that's a bit different, isn't it? And then it's like, well, it's almost not now. I mean, not that it's still minor compared to the amount of massive wedding weapons. Interesting name for a wedding. For the massive weddings that happen and the processes they go through, witnessing how much my brother's spending on his, and the interaction with him and his partner, and it's actually him who wants to really go out for it, and she's not too fussy. It's just so interesting, like, where these drives come from and how we do these massive social events. Or what if we could change funerals? Put the fun into funeral, inject it with funeral, and make it different, make it a celebration. However that is, what way to go to exchange at a death, rather than the pull that's so nasty and makes us resent death, because it's such a grim scenario and so unhappy, and everybody's deeply, deeply sad without almost a genuine, it's like sad for that person as well, like the partner or the family. It's like, you're really sad for them, and that's the heaviness that follows those events around. If that's the way that it has to be done, fine, but it doesn't. Let's look at what we get out of these things and what could we put into them. What feeling could we generate?
So there's two things there: grandiosity and expectation. Those two things are the themes of weddings and funerals. So I can tie in Indian weddings. When you were talking about being conditioned to deal with the funeral in a certain way, where people have to be crying and you have to be playing sad songs, they do this in Indian weddings when the bride is the last moments of the bride spending her time with her previous family, which is her parents and biological parents, and then moving towards the other side of the family, which is her in-laws. They always make the bride cry through like sad music, and then she's hugging all the loved ones because she's moving away. And I always used to wonder, and I remember one time about 10 years ago, I actually said it out loud, and it was a moment of quietness, and people just looked at me, and I'm just like, oh. But it was interesting what I said, and I said, look, she's not crying, yeah? You don't have to make her cry, and if anything, the groom is crying, not her. So let it be, but then they couldn't let it be, because obviously the female is supposed to cry because she's moving away, and the person that's moving away is supposed to cry. I'm just like, this is insane. And it's what you just said about the funeral. There's a certain expectation where it's like, it's really weird. It's one way we want to spend our entire lives denying that there is death. And when death does happen, it's like, okay, we're going to do everything what we're supposed to do in that period in this one little 3-hour event where we pour everything into it. And all the emotions come out and everything comes out, and it's just a mess. Instead of it being a gradual thing, it's just an absolute mess. And it's because you've been swept away by the grandiosity of the event, whether it's a very sort of, a celebratory event like a wedding or something like death. It's grandiose in two different extremes. You're suffering and you're going through pain, and then on the other side you're going through extreme levels of ecstasy and blissfulness. And it's just like, how's that happened? Why is the two extremes not found a middle ground? Why, like you said, why are funerals so miserable and boring, and why is everything so dark? And in the Indian culture, everyone would dress in white as opposed to being dressed in black, as a symbolic reference to say, you've become an enlightened being, you've transcended today this material realm, and you're going to go into the next realm, which is more spiritual. And that's what the white sort of color symbolizes, purity. Whereas in the Western tradition, it's dark and gloomy and black, and it's everything that's dark. And the coffin itself is it's miserable.
And the organ, man.
Oh my God, yeah.
Like, it's just the worst.
The organ used in the right way sounds amazing. Interstellar. Yes. Used in the right way sounds absolutely amazing, but then we use it in the most miserable way. And you would think this would just be exclusively to Western culture, but Eastern people have started doing the same thing, and now most of the funerals are in a church or a funeral hall. And I'm just like, this is a load of shite. Like, when I die, I want to die on a funeral, on a pyre. I want to be burnt alive. Well, not burnt alive. That would not be the right.
Everybody heard that there. We're doing this tonight.
Burn him alive like a witch. No, but I want to be burnt and cremated, and not set alight in a coffin. And that's what they're doing these days. Hindus, they do the cremation process, but all you do is you place the body in a coffin that's really expensive, like we mentioned in the previous podcast, and then you throw him in an oven and he burns, And if I wanted to do that, I'll just do what Hansel and Gretel did at least, have an environment where I can eat as much as I want and then die. It makes no logical sense if you look at it if you take it away from what society is doing and look at it purely from the objective point of view, for you to go in there miserable, and then having to carry that on for at least 6 months to 8 months of just grieving, misery after misery, and then every year and again, this is no disrespect to anyone that's doing this, when you grieve about the anniversary of a person that's passed away, for me, you'll be celebrating what you remember of them on that day. It's like, oh, what did I do last year when he was alive? Oh, we did this and that. I don't bloody talk about loss in that way, and maybe that's just me being delirious to processing it in that way, and maybe it's my way of handling that situation. But it just doesn't sound fun at all, just drowning in your own tears, and especially when the tears of sorrow as opposed to being tears of joy. You should be celebrating this person who died. In many situations in today's society, people have died because that, again, like what we said right at the start, comes back in full circle. It's compassion. They might have suffered their last 6 months, a year before their death because of cancer or whatever, tumors and whatever they've gone through, and now you realize, actually, thinking about it, moving away from all the sadness of his death, it's compassion that this person's passed away because now he's no longer in pain. Where's that aspect? Why is that not elevated? Well, it's not elevated because it doesn't go with the narrative. It doesn't really fit in with the narrative that we're trying to sell, of death being a scary thing. And what happens when you try and sell a narrative a certain way? Well, it's exactly that. You sell it, someone profits off it. And you look at the funeral companies, God, there's two things you make more money off, which is a prison system and the health system. And the third thing is funeral system. You make so much money off the funeral system. So if anyone wants to make a business, go into that industry. I know it's kind of miserable, but you make a lot more money off that. And like we said in the previous podcast, when you dress and put makeup on the cadaver, the dead body, it's exactly the same thing. I don't get the process at all. It's insane. And for a guy who's been brought up in an Eastern background and then being integrated into the Western culture, even to this day, I never fully understood it. I never fully understood why we make this such a miserable process. That's my little rant about it.
Like sorting out the bodies, if they've got a leg popping up here and around, fine, get them in order, make them look good. But with the makeup and whatnot, and the expense of the box, as you were saying, you said it logically, it doesn't make sense of the way it goes, but even symbolically, and that's maybe really why we do it, just out of habit, but to be the symbol of grief and the symbol of this person's going. So let's dress in black to show our sadness. the solemn gravity of the event, the music. Again, it all plays its part, but just in such a unhappy way, I think. Like even that, let's pay our respects. When you're carrying the coffin in, that bit I've always thought it's very respectful, it seems, when everyone's bringing the coffin in and they're walking inside. And that's probably the point where I think, there's that person lived a life in there, or just as I sit down and you see it. But then once it's been the impact of that was a human, that was an energy, that was what somebody's done, then it's just like, always gets really dull, I think. And the ones that I've been to or to reflect on recently, it definitely seems more for the partner of the person whose death it is, or the person closest to them, for them to go through the process and box it off, and not box it off, but have it done, have that box ticked. But I just think we're so lost in it, the money of what it costs, like the wedding. It is mad that we allow something that's almost, it's not essential, death is, of course, but like weddings and whatnot, they're not essential, but they're a staple point of somebody's life, a milestone, aren't they? Like buying a house and whatnot. And these things that people are almost going to have in their life that we make cost so much and so expensive. Even what coffin you're going to get, or what tombstone. Have something nice, but you can have something very simple and very nice. It's not how grand, how much jewels, or what kind of wood it was made with.
Well, you're going to burn it.
Yeah, it's either be buried or burned. And what's in there is inanimate. What in there is no longer alive. It's just a bone, or it's just flesh that's rotting. So even something symbolic for yourself that reminds you of that person, like the attachment we then create to the bodies is really strange, but we want it to be that person, don't we? We've not accepted grief, we've not accepted letting go, which is why that person's still there. Having somewhere to go, like the gravestone, I get that as well. But you could have your own place, your own event, rather than the body and that dead energy is there. There's stuff that I would really reflect upon if I was the head of whoever runs funerals for the West. But making it more an event rather than just grief, which is a big part of it, the sorrow is a big part of it, to find out healthier ways of working with that. Is it done at the funeral? Yes, but there are also fun and light-hearted parts and celebration at funerals. For me, very much so, that would be there.
So it's funny you said that about the celebration part, because I think what most people that are not attached to the person, whether it's a wedding or a funeral, come for is the food. And I find that really fascinating, how in a wedding, people won't be there for the words and the ritual process, and even in a funeral, they won't be there for the actual when they're talking about how amazing this person was, but then they'll turn up in their numbers for the food. I'm just like, this is what I mean. Like, you don't see the humor in this whole process. Like, there's a lightness to it. There's a lightness to this whole event, but you're disguising it. You're covering it up with all this misery and sorrow, just to play this role in this almost play almost. So it's funny how the whole food thing. I'm a big culprit of that. When we went to weddings in London, and there's a period of like 5 years where all my friends that I knew were getting married, and my cousins were getting married. I swear to God, every week would be a wedding in London, and we would literally play rock, paper, scissors in our siblings to decide who would go and then who would take our parents. But just to show up, have some food and go home. I really enjoyed that part of it, and maybe make something out of that as opposed to making the whole, like you said, carrying the coffin. There is some sort of symbolic respect towards that. I fully appreciate that. The way you walk the person in and the way you carry them. It's the same in Eastern traditions where you carry the dead body, but it's something that we have differently to the Western tradition, is you are spending time with that dead body. So your moment of grief, if we could keep that body longer in the West, keep the coffin open and just watch the person every morning, maybe for a week or maybe a month, then you start to realize that actually now, I think all my grieving that's happening, I've got memories of this person, but my memories are also not, they have to be transactional. They have to also go into the process. It has to be symbolic that when you bury the person or you burn the person, some of the memories go along with that. But I think that also creates more grief as well, because you feel as though you haven't spent enough time with that person, alone with that person when they've passed on as well. So that isn't fully met, and that's what creates grief. And I feel as though grief, again, it's all psychological. There's nothing out there you've created, because how can a person have this really traumatic experience, and then within a year later, maybe 2 years later, move on and be with another person, or just completely forget about it. How does that happen? It has to happen where the body completely breaks ties psychologically in that way. The mind breaks ties in that way. So why can't you bring that a little earlier? Why can't you have that period where you're breaking those ties in your mind and have it in the first couple of months of grieving instead of it being this long process? And some people have that. Some people have a better way of dealing with it, and we label it as that. They have a better way of dealing with it. So why can't you make that a universal thing? Well, we don't do it because, again, we don't address that issue. We don't see it as an issue. We treat the symptoms of it. So you get people that go to psychotherapists or psychologists, and Jordan Peterson had thousands of people come to him when they grieve about certain situations. But instead of addressing the whole process of grieving and how to deal with it, all you do is you're treating the symptoms of it. So if someone's gone through it, you're treating the symptoms of it and saying, okay, this is what we need to do to get you out of this, as opposed to saying, how do we stop that from happening, or how do we minimize that from happening? And I think that's what the problem is. I think we need to address it in that way. And you can either do that at an individual level. You can go away and say, you know what, I'm just going to address this. And like I said, you have to every day think about death in that way and say, it's going to happen. How am I going to address this? So do it in that way, or do it in a collective way, which is what the Native Americans used to do, which is be around more people, and go through the grieving process in that way. When in that movie that you watched, A New World, when Pocahontas was taken to Europe, when she found out that John Smith had passed on, when he didn't die, but when she found out that he died from rumors and news, she didn't know how to grieve. She didn't have those elders, she didn't have those people around her that she cared about that were there to support her in that grieving period. So what happens in today's society? Well, you're there for the funeral and days before leading up to the funeral, but as soon as the funeral's over, maybe you spend maybe a week with them, but most people, society tells you that you have to get back onto the horse and start working again, make more money. And you're left alone. So whether you like it or not, even if you make the excuse that, well, we should do this as a collective process, you're making that person suffer alone once life has to go back to normal. Once work tells you that you can't spend time with your brother and you need to go back to work, and you have to let him grieve on his own. When that happens, that person's already suffering through it alone. So why not treat that? Why not create a process where the person goes through that before it even gets to that stage? So yeah, I think that needs to be somehow sort of figured out in society.
Yeah, how the process is done and how we go about it and how other people respond it's creating a new network for it to work from, isn't it? And even that, I don't know the rules or how much time you get off after a funeral. Does it depend on if it's your partner, your spouse, brother, whatever? Is it different, or is it the same set time? And it should really be as generous as possible, I think, because when you're going through that death.
But then it goes into the category of, okay, I give you time off because you've directly suffered it. What about your siblings? What about your cousins? What about your family? They don't get the same amount of time off, do they? Because it's not directly happened to them.
No, true. And it's maybe a process happens where that person gets the same amount of time off with you if you are there for support. And, like any system, people can abuse things or they can not use it fully. But I think that would just make it so much more easier. You've got support from people that you love and who are nearby, and they will help you through that process. Because the whole thing is a process, isn't it? It's just, as you've said, when do we start working on it? Because before the death of yourself or of the person you're about to lose, well, the more awareness you have of when that's coming, the better, right? But the more you've looked into death as a subject on its own before or during, even easier, because you start to see the whole thing much more. Looking, is it the 4 or 5 stages of grief and what you go through there with your disbelief, anger, remorse, sadness, something along those lines. And going through that journey is like, okay, well, this is this part because it happens to almost everybody who goes through this process, so I know it works. But it's just taking out that extra element of you've got to do it on your own when you could have people with you if the system worked that way. And you've also got a partial or acceptance of death, which makes the personal grieving become easier over time or from when it gets off, because it's so tough to I mean, I can't imagine losing the people that I love on a deep level and not being prepared for it. If it's whipped away, also the manner of the death, how it occurs, it will also leave a different imprint on how you handle the aftermath. So the multiple factors, aren't they? But in general, give as much support and as much compassion and love to the situations as we can. We can't go wrong that way. We work from there. I think the whole funeral system is in need of a change now.
Yeah. But you would think that the more you have people that you care about, the more you're going to try and prepare yourself for it. Like, the more the more money you're trying to make in life, the more you start to prepare and start setting up different ventures for it. So why would we not do the same thing when it comes to the process of death? Like, if you've got people you really care about, even if it's just one person, why would you not try and go through the process in your head that maybe I need to also come to terms with the fact that this person obviously eventually will die. Maybe it might not be tomorrow, maybe it might not be in 2 years, 3 years time down the line, but eventually it's going to happen. So why doesn't a person go through that? And maybe, like you said, it's a systemic thing. We need to start teaching it right from the start. And well, first of all, we have to get through the first barrier, which is addressing how we see it ourselves and how the correct way, or maybe an alternative way of seeing it is, and implementing it and seeing how that works. Because what usually happens, and it happens all the time, it catches you off guard. And especially when someone is healthy, someone who's really healthy, and they take their life, you've got a completely different process of grieving, because you have to get over that anger part first of all, to go through that compassion part and say, God, I lost someone. And then you've got the other side, which is someone dies of old age. You grieve with that person in a different way. And then someone who's died accidentally, purely of accident, run over or whatever, you have to grieve with it in a different way as well. So it's identifying different forms of how to deal with these kind of situations and what kind of process it is. But then again, it all ties together. If you start early on and start to realize, you look at people you care about, you look at the woman you love, or the guy that you love in front of you every night, and just say, how am I going to deal with it? If I love this person this much, I must also take procedures or put procedures into place to deal with the loss of this person. So maybe that would be also something that you could start off doing in relationships. We know that not all relationships are going to stand the test of time. You're going to have breakups, you're going to have all these sort of things. So why not prepare for that? And when you say that sounds like you're almost wishing it upon your situation, but you're not doing that. You're just preparing for it in case something like that happens. And it's something I think Senya told me a couple of podcasts ago. She says that she has very little expectation of people. So when people hurt her or break up with her, it doesn't necessarily affect her to that level. It affects other people, because she has come to terms with that right from the start, that this person, I have no expectation of this person. Even though I'm close with this person, I don't have that much expectation of this person that other people do. So if they turn around and say, I've cheated on you, or I'm breaking up with you, it doesn't affect her to that level, because she's already prepared for it in a way. So
yeah, people can take that and go like, oh, why me? Yeah. Why wasn't I good enough? Or they do the opposite, go, that person wasn't good enough for me, they had all these bad qualities, and all it is just not accepting of how the situation has been, or you feel hurt, or you wanted a different outcome. And it's still, even the loss of a relationship, it is a death, it is a grieving process. It's another thing to learn from. So how do you respond when you've ended a relationship, or you've had your partner leave you? How did you behave? How did you feel? How did the whole thing go? Because you are losing a part of who you've become. Our life is our life, and it is how we live it. But when we're with somebody so close on an intimate level, we merge with them and we get their personality traits or certain ways that they think, or we become totally resistant to certain aspects like that. They were so far from us, we reject them. So when somebody leaves, that habit, that routine, not only that, but that person, those characteristics, how they were, all of that is gone. It's been a death. It's disappeared. So how people grieve over that and how long it takes them to get over the relationship isn't just to that person going, but to who they were as well. So it's great to be able to reflect and develop and accept death in a way, because this is how I feel now, because that bit of me is gone. Can we utilize that further and take it into a reflection on death? It's anything where we're intimately wound with something that leaves a pet, a family member, a death, a relationship, Father Christmas not being real, whatever it is, we're so intimately connected to these belief systems or our expectations. When we let them go, and not, what Ksenia was saying, and not expecting from people to be a certain way, or they will have to treat me like this. and not taking it personally so much when they go, oh, that partner's cheated, or they've left and they've hurt me, or I don't feel the same about that person anymore. Because even if you refer it to yourself, everything's allowed to change, you know. Let go. Once again, just like with death comes, just be able to let go. We put so much personality and promise on the relationship or on how that person is or how we should be treated. That's what causes so much suffering, because it's so high up there. We expect so much, and conditioning again. You should be treated like this. You should never be spoke to like this. You're going to get the Disney partner, or it's going to be like, and it's if they don't fit the mold, then that person kicks out. It's not good enough, or I deserve better, or that person's so mean to me, and they might not be, and it's what we expect and demand. When it's self-acceptance, life is doing all these movements all the time with all these different people. It's never going to be the mirror of what you want it to be out there. Yeah, letting go, another form of death over and over again.
Yeah. Right, I think that is a great place to wrap up. Yeah, so I feel as though in this one we definitely did tie the whole death thing together. I don't know how you felt about that, but I felt in the last one we went into the symbology of it and the different sort of philosophies of death, and then in this one we've actually talked about how death is in the Western tradition, how we would address it and how the system addresses it. So yeah, I think this is a perfect way to wrap this up. This is the first time we've done a part 1 and a part 2.
It is, yeah.
Maybe we'll make this more of a regular thing if you guys want to have these sort of things. Well, to be fair, it has to be based on the topic itself.
Yeah.
Like if you feel as though in one conversation we've pretty much covered all the bases, there really isn't any need to go into a part 2. But I feel like a big topic like death, it has to branch out into different ways, isn't it? Like we can also tie it in with karma, which is what we did in the last one, and your sort of approach to what this thing is. So yeah, right. Any last words?
Thank you for the conversation, mate.
Yeah, man, I really enjoyed this one.
Interesting to get into death, and even though it's a 2-parter, I can see it being more in the future. There's so many areas of it to discuss and to go into and to use for spiritual practice. So I'm sure we'll return to this at some point. Yeah, definitely. Also, guys, if you've got any questions or if you've got any other topics that you want us to talk about, feel free to shout that at us or drop it in the comments or just message us directly and let us know. And if you've got any questions in relation to what we've just talked about on each of the podcasts, I think this is something that we maybe need to mention at the end. Feel free to message us directly or comment, so then we can talk about it. But yeah, perfect, Craig. So this was podcast 20. As always, it's going to be on Instagram as a preview. It's going to be as a video format on YouTube and on Spotify, so you can listen to us if you're doing things. But I would say this one is a good one to actually watch us on. Do you think? Always to watch you, mate. Always click on that.
Even though we've got a really bright light here. Right, we're done.
I'll
see you guys in the next one.